Welcome to the Words That Change Lives podcast, helping leaders, coaches, and small business owners to 10 times the impact of their message. Join us as we delve into the art of powerful language, enabling you to speak with unwavering honesty, communicate authentically, and create a lasting impression with every word.
Sometimes when we are running a business and we are trying to find ways to market ourselves, generate leads, build a connection with potential customers, it can feel pretty exhausting. You're a one-man band maybe, you are doing it all, you're doing all the accounting, you're doing all the website stuff, you're doing all the marketing, and you're doing the thing that you're meant to be doing, which is the service that you're offering or the product you're selling. And when you're starting out, this can feel overwhelming, and I remember it very, very clearly myself. But there are a few things that are almost like a key that can unlock that problem and challenge. And the topic of today's episode and the amazing guest that I'm speaking to on today's episode really is the description of the key that has unlocked that for me and her and all of my clients and all of her clients too. And her name is Susan Payton. She is a wife, mum, storyteller, author, speaker, cheerleader and connector. She's a lifelong learner and an eternal optimist. She is someone who has experienced her own challenges in the world of running her own business and setting things up. And she learned along the way about stories. She's always used stories, but she really connected with this when she shared her own story in an early community that she had built. And it had such an incredible impact on her business. She knew that was how she wanted to help people. So now she is passionate, helping business owners to craft stories and narratives that launch businesses, build brands, and deeply connect with their target market. She is an author of The Business of Stories, which you can find on Amazon, Waterstones, Barnes & Noble. It's a fantastic book. I've got it. And in this episode of Words That Change Lives, we are talking about the places that you can use stories that you might not know about, you might not have used, or we're going to bust some assumptions that are made about storytelling and storytelling in business that you're really going to want to tune in and listen to. So I hope you enjoy this chat today. Let me know what you think and enjoy. So what I find, Susan, is that the people that I work with or the people I talk to when it comes to this amazing, beautiful, wonderful subject is it's quite a kind of one-dimensional view for a lot of people in terms of how to use storytelling as a tool in their business. And in my experience, I think a lot of people sort of wrap their minds around the fact that it's their story, that the story that they tell is their story, the core story. I know you use that term. I use that term in terms of, where you came from, what you've gathered along the way, and why you are now doing what you're doing. But it's so much more than that. And of course, we're going to dive into that today and unpack that. But what's your experience of that in terms of the general assumptions that people make?
Yeah, I think it's very much that. They think they've got their one story that they tell. And like you said, that is important to have that story and to be able to tell that in 30 seconds or 30 minutes, right? So you want to have that story ready. But of course, there are new stories every single day. Like you've been on a journey that is full of experiences and setbacks and insights and passions and ideas and all of the things that have happened to you. And you can't possibly get that across in one story. So one of the things I talk about quite a lot is sharing moments along the way rather than sharing that whole story, to share moments along the way that were significant or defining or pivotal. But when you look back now, you realize they were quite significant moments along the way. then you can also think about your business, right? And businesses and brands don't just pop up from nowhere. There's always been a journey. So that business journey is full of stories and milestones and, the ups and downs. And we all know what building a business and being a business owner is like, right? It's a roller coaster journey.
Yeah.
And that's full of stories. And then, of course, you've got your customer story, which is really critical, right? To understand their story, to be able to share their story, show them that you get them, show them that you know where they are, you know where they want to go. And then there's all the stories every day that are happening all around you. You know what's going on, your thoughts, your reflections, your behind the scenes. So I really talk to people about weaving storytelling into everything that they do. Like, just think like a storyteller. And one of the tips I give to people in my group is, when you get to the end of the day, just think back and think, is there anything that happened today that is a story that I could share? And you might not want to share it straight away, but just capture them. Have a little notebook, keep a note of little things that happened during the day that could be stories that you could share in the future.
I love that, because what that actually is saying is, and again, this is another problem that I know that people face, is they see it as like a really big thing, right? That they've got to master and then share with the world, right? And like with any big thing, especially, and we'll talk about vulnerability in a minute, because I think that's an important aspect of this, right? Is especially when we're thinking, oh God, I've got to do something vulnerable. Telling a story means sharing something of myself that I don't normally do, or I haven't been used to doing before. However, when we break it down into moments, that's more palatable.
Yeah.
That's more digestible, right? Because those moments aren't all about our stumbles and our catastrophes and our pit moments and our adversity that we've overcome, which a lot of people think is
Yeah.
what a story is about. It's actually, as you say, it's those sort of micro elements of your day that you can collect together and store somewhere. I recommend my clients have a story journal. It's such an important thing, because otherwise they just dribble out your ears, don't they?
Yeah.
They're gone if
Yeah.
we don't capture them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that people think is that their story's got to be dramatic, right? It's got to be fit for a Hollywood blockbuster film. And people say to me, I haven't got a rags to riches story. I've never died and seen a white light, and, I haven't got a dramatic story. But I always say to people, but those stories are not relatable to most people, right? Because we don't have that story either. Most people have your story. They're just the ups and downs. They're just getting through the day, getting through the tough times, the wins, the failures, just that journey. When I shared my story back 2015, I called it the bumps and bruises along the way, right? Because that's it. But people can relate to that, right? The story that I shared back then, and we can talk about that in a minute, but it wasn't a story that, was dramatic. It was just a very normal story of the things that I was struggling with at that time. I was a single mum back then. I had some health issues. I'd put a load of money into property, and then the property market crashed, but lots of people related to my story because they've struggled at times. They've maybe done things that didn't work. They've had health issues along the way. So it is those everyday, very relatable stories that people will resonate with, rather than the big, dramatic Hollywood blockbuster type stories that most people don't relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. So again, it's like breaking that big thing down into understanding that actually the vulnerability comes from just sharing that, hey, we all make mistakes. We all learn through our bumps and our bruises. I've experienced that too, and I can help others. Now, so I have had the same experience in that my TEDx talk was about something incredibly normal. And at the time, I didn't. I guess I thought, well, who am I to tell an incredibly normal story? There's nothing fancy about this story at all. It's just about a mum struggling with their identity and having marriage problems, really, but how many other people struggle with their identity after having kids and also have marriage struggles as a result of that. And that was a sort of pivotal moment on my journey, that I was able to share that. And it's the relatability of that story that is the thing that connects with people. I would like to just talk about those three different elements that you shared there, in particular the customer story. And what defines that when you're thinking about, okay, well, there's my story and there's the story of the business. What about the story of the customer? What does that look like? And I guess what do people not know about that when they're sort of entering into using stories?
I think that people get very stuck on this idea that a lot of marketers talk about, which your ideal client avatar, you've got to, where do they eat and what do they drive, and, what's their wife called, or, how many kids have they got? And I can see that there are times that information might be useful. But what I'm talking about is, what is their story? Like, where are they at right now? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What do they want? Where are they stuck? Who are they looking for? What help do they need? So it's really understanding their story. And the more you understand their story, the more relatable you can make your stories. The more you understand their story, the more you'll know what stories are going to resonate with them. And one of the questions I get asked a lot is, how do you know which story to share? Like, I've got loads of stories, but how do I know which stories to share? And how do I make them relevant to my audience? And I always say, how well do you know your customer's story? Do you know where they're at? Do you know how they're feeling? Do you know what they've tried? Is this a new challenge, or is this something that's been going on for years? Is this a high priority for them, or is this just something that's niggling in the background? It's really unpacking their story. And there's lots and lots of ways to unpack your customer story. The best way, of course, is talking to them. But it's really understanding that story. And the more you understand the story, the more you will be able to share that story in your content, right? And be able to say, I get it. I know what it feels like. I understand where you're at. I understand the journey. And we all want to be understood, right? We all want to be seen and heard and understood. So when we actually connect with somebody and see that they really get me, actually, like, I remember I was in a group I was in, and there was a woman who said that she worked with women who were aged between 28 and 30 and had just been promoted to their first leadership role. And I was like, wow, like, that is so specific. But the more I thought about that, I thought, God, how well is she going to know their story? She's going to know their story so well. Like, there is a reason that she has narrowed it down to, like, a 3-year period when something very specific is happening in somebody very specific's life. She knows their story really, really well. Do you think that she's going to know what they need and that she's going to be able to help them? Yeah, because she knows their story. And that's where the power comes from, is really understanding that customer story.
The way that you describe that is, so I used to hate the ICA work, where do they live? What newspapers do they read?
Yeah.
Where do they hang out online? It's like, oh God. However, when we look at it from this perspective, from the story perspective, it gets so much more interesting. It gets so much more, you can feel it. You can connect with it. You can really understand it. You mentioned that lady there who had a very specific demographic and psychographic of women. Well, that was me back when I was that age, because my first leadership role was at the age of 28.
Right.
And it was a huge, massive transition for me.
Yeah.
And I made so many mistakes. But you can see there that actually she's got a sweet spot.
Yeah. And can you imagine if that 28-year-old you had come across somebody who said, I work with women 28 to 30, first leadership role? In my book, I talk, there's lots and lots of stories in there. I talk about lots and lots of people. That is probably the person that I've had the most inquiries about. Is people have literally messaged me and said, I read your book. Who is the woman that works with, because it's so specific, people are like, that's me, or that's my daughter, or that's my girlfriend, like, can you pass me on her details? Because clearly she can help them.
And that's where getting really specific into the story.
Yeah.
And I call it with my clients the underworld utopia golden path, in terms of, where are they before they start working with you? What are they seeing, feeling, hearing, doing? What are they experiencing? What about when they finish working with you? And what's the golden path that bridges those two things? Getting really clear on that then means you can talk their language when you're sharing things on social media, when you're writing emails to your list, when you're at networking events or giving talks. And you can use that as a story. That's a really good example there of something I think a lot of people would be like, no, we don't use stories to do ICA work. Actually, you do. Sorry for anybody who doesn't know that acronym. Ideal client audience, for anybody not understanding what that acronym means. It's the work that is required when you are understanding the problems that you can solve with your service, if you're a service-based business, also a product-based business as well, and how you can take them on a journey. Thank you for sharing that. But as always, I love a bit of the reason why I got into the whole storytelling profession myself was because I picked it up along the way in the corporate world. Had very senior actuaries who were very introverted, very technical, who couldn't hold a room. They came to me, I coached them. That's where I picked up storytelling. And alongside that, I was studying evolutionary psychology, and it all just sort of melded together. This is why we tell stories, and everybody can tell stories. It's in our DNA. It's been ingrained over centuries and centuries and centuries. What's that story for you? Where did it start for you?
Looking back, I always loved storytelling. Like, English was my favorite subject at school. Even the work that I did many, many, many years ago, I worked for Capital Radio, right? If you lived in London, you'll know Capital Radio. I worked on the Chris Tarrant Breakfast Show. And I used to love going through. We used to get a lot of American papers and magazines sent over because they used to have these wild stories in them, like aliens landed on my lawn. And, so I used to go through these publications, and I used to write these short stories and give them to Chris, and he used to read them out on the air. I also got into events. And it's only later when I look back and I thought, well, that's what an event is, right? You're bringing somebody into a story. You're taking them on a journey. Like, it's an experience. But it wasn't until 2015 and I had a community. I built this community for women in business. Believe it or not, when I started looking around for support for women in business in around 2014, I couldn't find anything, right? Facebook groups weren't a thing then. So I created a community. It was called the Business of Mums back then. And I, amongst other things in the group, I was offering coaching, but nobody was buying my coaching, right? And I was really struggling to be seen and heard in my own group, And the problem was that I wasn't really articulating the value of working with me, right? Because I didn't really know it myself. I knew I had things to offer. I knew I could help people. I'd always worked for myself. I knew what some of my strengths were. I knew I could help people, but I didn't really, really know how. So I was my idea was, I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a plan, but my idea was that if I got all of these women together and I asked them what they needed, and if it wasn't something I could help them with, I could bring in experts, which I did, but maybe I would find the thing that people were asking for that I was like, oh, I can help you with that. And so I started throwing a lot of money at all the marketing things that we think we've got to do, right? And I had an all singing, all dancing website built with a, notice board and all these fancy things on it. And it cost thousands back then because, they weren't click and template things. Everything was coded. And I even, and this makes me cringe, I even employed a marketing agency and paid them lots of money. Because I just thought, I just need more people in the group. If I get more people in the group and more people know about it, then people will come and they'll want my coaching. And then I was sat right here where I am sat now talking to you one evening, having a glass of wine, and I was talking to my husband, and he said, "How's your business going?" And I started to cry. And I said, "Who am I kidding? I haven't got a business. I've got a group. You know, it was a free group, so I wasn't getting any income from that. And everybody loves it and everybody's engaged and everybody's saying how brilliant it was. But it's not a business. And in fact, I'd used up my savings. Like, you know, I'd put money into this, but it was all the wrong things because I didn't have these key foundational pieces in place. I didn't know my ideal client story. I didn't understand my value. You know, there were so many bits missing, which I didn't know back then because you don't know what you don't know. And he said, you know, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I don't know. I'm not ready to give up yet, but I need to do something different. You know, what I'm doing, just kind of telling people, hey, book a call, I can help you, isn't working. So I went to bed that night, and I'm a big fan of putting a question in my brain before I go to sleep, because there's a good chance that when I wake up in the morning, I'll have the answer, right? So I went to bed that night thinking, what do I need to do? Like, something's got to change. And it can't be, somebody had quoted me £30,000, right, to do this huge marketing thing. And I thought, I don't think it's throwing more money at it. You know, I think I've got to do something different. And I went to sleep and I woke up the next morning and I thought, I'm just going to go into the group and be really honest. Like, I'm going to go in and tell them who I am and the journey that I've been on and why I created this group and what I want for the group. And, you know, I'm just going to be really, really honest. And of course, we didn't have lives and Zooms and all of those things back then. So I sat down to write my story. And actually, I find that really easy. Like, storytelling's always come quite easily to me. So I sat down and wrote out my story. Like I said, I called it the bumps and bruises along the way, something like that. I wrote it all out, put some little photos in. And I just talked about that journey that I'd been on and what had led me here and the things that I'd done and, you know, what had got me through the tough times, you know, especially when I had been a single mum and when I'd had health issues. I had ME for a few years. So I talked about all of that in the story. But I also talked about, you know, where I was now on my journey, what I wanted, what I felt like I could help people with. I put all of this into a story. And then I sent it out and I literally pressed send and published this thing. And then I had this moment of panic. And I think a lot of people will resonate with this, is I suddenly thought, does anybody want to know my story? Like, does anybody really care about my story? Like, isn't that actually a bit indulgent of me to go in and think that they want to spend time listening to my story? And my other thought was, maybe I've been too honest. Like, maybe, you know, actually sharing that this, you know, I wasn't some 6-7 figure business owner at that point, you know, and actually being very honest about where I was and how much I'd put into this group. And, you know, I just suddenly thought maybe I was too honest and people will just think, oh, okay, you know, she's not quite the person we thought she was. But I needn't have worried. Literally within a couple of minutes, I got the first message came through and it made me emotional. It was from a woman, and all women in the group. And it was from a woman saying, thank you so much for sharing that story. Like, I totally, totally relate to it. And here's why. And then she started to tell me a little bit of her story, right? Because that's what happens when you start sharing stories, is you're opening that space for other people to share theirs. And she could see the connections to my story, and she shared that with me. And while I was reading it, another message came in, and that was from somebody saying, you know, thank you for being so honest and open, and, you know, and refreshingly honest. You know, a lot of people don't actually talk about the bad days and the tough times. It's really great to hear that, you know, it's very inspiring. People started calling me, my story was inspiring, which I thought, wow, I never thought of my story as inspiring. But the thing is, we've all overcome 100% of the challenges that we have faced to date, right? So that is inspiring. When you hear other people going through a challenge that maybe is similar to something that you're going through right now, and they got through it, that's inspiring. So I got loads of these messages coming through. And then some of those messages, people were saying, so how do we work with you? And what is it that you can help us with? And could you help me share my story? And I was blown away. I was absolutely blown away, because the only thing that honestly, telling my story that day changed my business and changed my life. I know that sounds dramatic. It absolutely did. And without a doubt has led me to be here today with all of the things that I've done and created, is because of that day that I went in and shared my story. The response blew me away and showed me just how powerful storytelling is.
Ooh, that is a powerful story. Something I can really relate to, you know, having done that myself on the TEDx stage, and how life-changing that was. And doesn't it just goes to show how powerful
Yeah.
stories really are to humans and the human experience, not just in business, but in life, in terms
Yeah.
of how we connect with each other, we make meaning of the world. We are meant to be connected. That's how we've evolved. And so doing that by sharing stories, which we used to gossip around campfires, gossip is part of what keeps us together, and stories are part of that gossip. So in a way, you know, it's just so reassuring, and it's really great to hear that origin story.
It's funny when people say, oh, I'm not a very good storyteller, you know.
Yeah.
And I say, do you realize that you tell stories all day long? You know, when you're recounting your day to your family, when you're sitting around the dinner table with friends, you know, it's all storytelling. It's just, there is, you know, telling stories in business, then you just want, of course, you need to be a little bit more strategic about it. Like everything in business, you want to know why you're sharing your story, who you're sharing it with, what the purpose of the story is, and all of that. But everybody is a storyteller.
Well, let's talk about that then in the business context,
Yeah.
because I think that's where people go, okay, well, yeah, I do share my story. So so maybe I can, but I've no idea how to, you know, get all the right things in, or, you know, include the right parts. Like, you know, a lot of people saying to me, this just too much. You know,
Yeah.
I can't you fit that in. And this is where, again, people make the mistake of thinking sharing your story is sharing your life story. What other sort of mistakes do you see, or maybe underused opportunities do you see when you're working with people?
Yeah. So definitely packing too much in is a big one. And it's probably the feedback I give more than anything else inside my group to people is, that's great, but that's not one story. That's 5 stories in there, you know? And then I actually pull them out and I say, you know, that story of walking out of your job is one story. You know, the health issues that you faced because of the stress of it, that's another story, you know? And I literally pull it apart and show them that apart from anything else, you know, one, you're going to overwhelm people because that's a lot for people to process, right? It's a bit like, I've used this analogy yesterday. It's a bit like, you know, when you go to a carvery and people pile up their plate, you know, like so high, it's ridiculous. Like it almost makes you feel sick looking at it. You know, stuffing everything, you know, too much into your story is a bit like that. Whereas I like food to be out on the table and I can have a little bit of that and a little bit of that. And, you know, and if I want a bit more, I'll go back for that. So I like to think of storytelling a bit like that. It's like break it down into little very digestible, bite-sized chunks. And then people will read the next one and the next one, right? Because they know they're nice little snippets, little stories that are very easy to engage with, rather than, whoa, like I've got to read that 3 times to process everything that's in there. So definitely putting too much in is a common mistake that I see people make. I think another mistake that people make is not starting the story in a way that makes people want to read on, right? So they don't pay enough attention, or they don't give enough thought to what's that first couple of lines. Because I've read stories that people have shared and I've thought, that story really gets going in the 3rd paragraph, right? Like now I want to read the rest of the story, but you would have lost me in the first 2 paragraphs because you were giving me all the background. You were filling in, giving me all this information that I didn't really need. So quite often, again, feedback I give people is like, remove the first 2 paragraphs. You actually don't need them. Like, just go straight into the story. Where does a James Bond film start? Right,
with the chase,
bang with the chase, right? Cut to the chase. He's running across the rooftops. He's being shot at. They don't tell us what's going on. They don't tell us where he is. They don't set the scene. They don't tell us what they're going to tell us. All of those things we've been trained to do. They just cut straight to the moment, and you're gripped. You don't miss the opening scene of a James Bond film, do you? I remember my daughter when I was going to see The Greatest Showman, and I remember my daughter saying, "Mum, make sure you're there on time because you won't want to miss the opening scene." Like, we love musicals, we're like, and that's it. That's the thing with your story is you want to give it just a bit of thought of like, how am I starting this story? Because you don't want to lose people, like, in the first couple of lines or couple of seconds, or, however you're sharing your story. I kind of talk about writing quite a lot, but of course it could be video, it could be anything, but you want to grab people's attention. And probably the third mistake that I see people make is it's a little bit clunky. Like, they haven't really thought through the purpose of the story. And I just touched on this before when I said, you do want to be strategic about everything in your business, right? You want to put the effort in to make it really easy for somebody to engage with your story. So we've got to kind of know why you're sharing that story and what the purpose is. And, if there's a message there, we need that message to come through. So you do need to know some of the principles of storytelling and have a nice structure to be able to use to make sure that your story makes sense and has got purpose and takes people on a journey. Even if it's a moment you're describing, you're still taking people on a little mini journey. You're still taking them there into that moment with you. So I think, I think some people just think, oh, story, tell a story, tick that box, done. I've told a story, but they haven't really thought it through and actually made sure that the story is going to create the connection that they want it to create with the people they want to work with. So that's where it takes a little bit of thought around making it relevant and relatable to the right people.
Oh, there's so many things there. I totally agree with everything you're saying there. And I think going into the sort of starting just at the chase, cutting to the chase, the big bang, I call it. And I think in speaking terms, they call it a nested loop, where you're starting with a story where you're in the action, you're putting that person in a world tour, you're putting them in at the middle of the story at like a crunch moment. And then you can come back and set the scene and set a bit of context after that, but grab their attention where it's needed. So I love that. And I love that simple, just remove the first 2 paragraphs in a sort of writing sense. I love that. That's such a simple thing, but it's just so effective. The other thing is that having the golden nugget of whatever it is you're saying. A story can be like a couple of sentences long. It doesn't have to be like this massive long thing, but it's got to have a purpose. It's got to have a reason for you sharing it, not just because. And another thing that I see is this sort of timeline storytelling. I've got another podcast episode on it where people think that telling a story is recounting a timeline of events. This happened, then this happened, then in 2015, and then the month later that happened, and then after that this happened, and then after that that happened. And it kind of loses its magic when people are just recounting a linear timeline of events, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it needs to have that. So what is the purpose of you sharing this particular story in this particular moment? Get really clear on that purpose. Keep that in your mind, and then you can remove what you don't need and just focus on the elements of the story that you need to share.
The question I always ask people is, what's the story really about?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're like, oh, well, it's about, like, I remember giving somebody feedback on a story, and it was a bit of that recounting events that happened. And it was something that happened in their childhood. And I said, what's the story really about? And what it was really about was that his mum had believed in him even when he didn't. Like, that's what the story was really about. And the minute we realize that that's what the story is really about, we completely could rewrite the story and bring emotion in and bring all of the stuff that people are going to relate to, because the stuff we relate to actually is how they were feeling, right? It's not what was happening, it's how they were feeling. And we could completely change that story around now that we knew what the story was really about.
I love that, because that gets to the nub of the purpose of the thing that's going to connect that one human being to another, rather than just recounting an event. Asking that question, what's this really about, kind of unlocks the whole purpose and the emotion, or whatever it is. It might not be an emotion, it might be something else, but it's that connection with that part of the story. And wow, that sounds really powerful. I bet that was quite profound for your client.
Yeah, it was.
So we've talked about mistakes, we've talked about assumptions, but let's talk about some of these things, these places, these parts of our lives in the business world where maybe stories are being underused, and where you can actually capitalize on them.
Yeah, so many. I think I said earlier, I one of the things I remind people I work with is ask the question, how would a storyteller approach this? Right? I'm writing a proposal. I'm writing a lead magnet. I'm creating a freebie that I'm going to invite my ideal clients to download. I'm writing a presentation. How would a storyteller approach this? They'd weave in a little story, right? They would look for opportunities to weave in a story. If it was something like a proposal, like maybe you've got a little story of somebody that you work with, had the transformation that this client that you're preparing the proposal for wants to have, right? Maybe you weave in a little bit of your story. A lot of people relate to where I was back in 2015, trying all those marketing things, throwing money at it, thinking I've got to learn more marketing things, thinking I've got to do it all. I need to hire an agency. And I didn't have to do any of that. So I often weave that story into things that I'm creating just to show people I was where you are now. And this is what I did. And if you want to go on that path with me, I can help you do that. So definitely looking for opportunities in the stuff that you're already creating, Even I had a message from somebody in the group the other day who said that she works for charity, and she was doing a funding application. And she said, no, she's done loads of funding applications before, but she thought, oh, how would a storyteller approach this? Well, they'd weave in stories. So she actually started weaving in lots of little stories into the funding application. And they got the funding that they'd asked for. And she came into the group and was like, oh my God, it's like magic. It was like, she said it was the missing piece of the work that I was doing. It was the missing piece. I wasn't using stories. So there's so many opportunities. When you're having conversations with people, like whether you call it a discovery call, a sales call, whatever you want to call it, that is a massive opportunity to one, unpack their story, right? And that's where I always start, is find out their story. Like, start by asking questions. Where are they now? How are they feeling? What are they thinking? What do they want? Where do they want to go? What's in the way? Like, unpack that story, because that person will then feel listened to, right? And understood. But also, that helps you to really understand your story. Then you can share a little bit of your story, but you'll know what bits of your story are going to be really relevant for that person, because you've taken the time to understand their story first. And that's where my kind of framework with my 3 stories, personal, business, customer, that's why they're always intertwined, because the more you understand and get clarity on each of those stories, the more relevant and relatable everything that you share will be, and more focused on that specific person that you want to help. So definitely lots of storytelling when you're having conversations with potential clients, right? It's not about telling them what you do, what the program is, how much it costs. Yes, of course they want that information, but start with the story, their story, your story, client stories that you've had that are very similar to what your the client that you're talking to is trying to achieve. Honestly, there's so many ways. If people who are creating a course, right? We did a session in my group on creating courses. And I said, right, think about the person that's going to buy this course, right? Even if it's a self-study course, you still want them to feel like they're going on a journey with you, that you're going to be there for them, right? Even if it's just you're there for them on videos, or whatever your course looks like. But by sharing stories about the journey that you're going to be taking them on, and what that's going to look like, and where it's leading to, and what success looks like, never assume that the people that you're talking to know what success looks like, because actually a lot of the time they don't know what it feels like to, not be stuck where they're stuck, because they haven't got past that yet. So, kind of sharing stories that position you as the guide, as the person that's going to take them by the hand and lead them through this journey, reassuring them that you can get them through it, that they can do it, that they have got what it takes. When they'll be doubting themselves, you can be sharing stories along the way to encourage and inspire. So honestly, we just look for opportunities to weave stories into absolutely everything. And if you have read my book, you will know that I weave stories into every single chapter. If you're sharing tips, you're just sharing 3 ways to, well, then give me 3 little stories, tiny little stories. Like you said, I think that's another misconception, is stories are some long form, beautifully crafted narrative, hero's journey, all of that. A story could literally be 3 sentences. But by weaving them in and just bringing each of those tips to life, with a real life example, is really powerful, and people find that really helpful. So, yeah, I think, people think it's my story. It's the one I tell when I'm doing a talk, or it's, me posting a story on social media. But actually, look at everything you're doing in your business. Anything that your ideal client or clients are going to interact with, see, hear, then think, how can I weave stories into that?
I love that. And I particularly like the point you made about it's part of a conversation.
Yeah.
It's fact finding. When you're talking to a potential client, whether that's on a discovery call or like a networking event, or you're just having, you can pick clients up from anywhere. I've just signed a corporate type client from just through, friends. And it was by having a conversation at a barbecue where actually I was having a conversation with them. I wasn't doing it particularly consciously, only because this is so ingrained in my mind now. But, through that fact finding, just asking questions and then sharing parts of my story, they then contacted me a few weeks later and said, I would love to work with you. Can we have a meeting, because what you said really resonated, and we really need your help. It's in having, and then you're selecting again. It's not like you're not doing this unethically. This is completely ethical. This is
human to human.
exactly right. You're selecting from your bank of stories, from your vault of gold, and you're selecting the right story to share with that person, to form that connection, so that there's that relatable feeling and that bond. It's something that we can't fully get our hands around and describe. It's a feeling when we have that sort of connection. And as you say, that can be in every single thing you do. When you're pitching for business, when you're having discussions, when you're in meetings, when you're in briefings, when you're in presentations, where you're writing any type of content, when you are writing a book, when you're doing public speaking, absolutely every workshops, all of that sort of stuff, every single part of your business can benefit from using stories.
Yeah. I actually start every single masterclass with a story. I don't introduce myself. I don't tell them what I'm going to cover. I just start with a story. And so many people have said to me, like, I literally hung on your every word from the minute you open your mouth, because you brought me, again, straight into a story, right? I grabbed their attention. And I think so many people have followed that format that we've all been taught, and, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then introduce yourself. And then, and it's people switch off, right? Because it's not grabbing their attention. It's not engaging them. So I start everything that I do with a story, short story. It might be my story. It might be a client story. It might be one of the stories I share is about selling stuff on eBay, right? But I just start with a story, because then I know I've got their attention.
And it works, because all of your stuff is incredible online when speaking, you do lives and things like that. It clearly works. You've got a really successful business, and it's so great to hear about where this has come from for you and the journey. But with all my guests, I ask the same question at the end of our chat, and that is, what words have changed your life?
Yeah, it's when I first started doing, working with people, and when I really realized that storytelling was going to be my thing, and I changed from the business of mums to the business of stories, and suddenly I knew I needed to get visible. And I'd never been visible before. I'd always been behind the scenes, right? I worked for celebrities. I was behind the scenes. I organized events. I was behind the scenes. Like, I never got up on the stage. I never wanted to. I had a fear of public speaking. So I got to a point where I knew that I was going to have to start getting out there, right? And this is even before I'd written the book. But people, because everybody's interested in storytelling, people quite quickly started asking me, can you come on the podcast? Can you come and talk on our stage? And it absolutely terrified the life out of me. Like, I would say I was on the verge of it being a phobia, right? I would shake, my voice would, I'd be sweating. And I remember thinking at one point, like, why am I even putting myself through this? Like, then, maybe I don't have to do any of that stuff. Maybe I'll just write, and kind of hide behind my writing, and I won't put myself out there. And then I was working with a client, and I was helping her unpack her stories. And she is a psychotherapist, and she had an amazing story, and I was helping her with stuff. And then we were chatting one day. It was quite towards the end of our work together. And I said to her, everything that you do is fascinating. I find fascinating, because I've got this real fear of public speaking, and actually just standing, talking in a group, it's just that all eyes on me, is real fear. And she said to me, well, what's going through your head when the fear starts? What's going through your head? And I said, well, I guess I'm thinking, like, what are they going to think of me? And what if they don't like it? And what if they think this? And what if they think that? And she said, oh, okay, I see the problem. And I said, what is it? And she said, you're making it about you. And honestly, I can't tell you that shift in my brain at that moment. She said, what if you didn't make it about you? What if you made it about the people that you're speaking to? And it was such an aha moment for me and game changing. Like, honestly, I now speak on stages. Like, I've spoken in Barcelona, or I've spoken at, conferences, big rooms full of people. And I'm absolutely fine because I don't make it about me anymore. And the minute I hear, because of course that little voice comes in, oh, what if that? And I just stop right there and I go, it's not about me. It's not about me. It's about the one person that really needs to hear this today. Even putting a post out, right? And people go, oh, I'm a bit holding back, a little bit hesitant about putting stuff out there that they're going to be a little bit vulnerable. But just remember, it's not about you. You're not putting your story out there for you. You're putting it out there for the person that it's going to resonate with, the person it's going to inspire. Somebody could make a decision today after reading your story that changes the trajectory that they were on.
Amen to that.
Yes.
I love that.
That's it. 4 words. It's not about you.
I love that. So the first conference I put on myself, I gave a keynote at that conference, and the title was "It's not about you, but it's all about you." Right?
Yes.
and the whole point was, it's not about you because it's about all those people that you can help, even just one person.
Yes.
Right? And so you've got to move yourself out of the way of the message you're delivering. But it's all about you because you can own the delivery of that message. So it's not about you, but it's all about you. And I think that is for anyone. So that was just a shift for you, like literally like that, a mindset.
All that years of therapy. All that taking myself back to my childhood and standing up in class and literally 4 words completely changed my outlook. And I, it's a mantra in my group now. Anytime anybody's holding back, and we just say, "Oh, you're making. What if it's not about you? What if you could?" And the story might be about you, absolutely. But if we go back to that thing of what's the story really about, and that's the message that I want to share, and there's someone out there that needs to hear it. That's why you're sharing that story.
I am buzzed. I love talking about this stuff.
We could talk all day, right?
Yeah, we could. Thank you so much for sharing this and sharing the fact that, there are so many places that you can use your stories. For anybody wanting to know more about Susan, check out the show notes. All Susan's links will be in there so that you can find out more about her and get in touch. And thank you so much, Susan, for coming on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to Words That Change Lives. Please rate, review and follow on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really means the world and helps me to reach more people so that we can all harness the power of our words and change lives for the better.